Welcome to my channel. I am Professor Morrison. The whisper you hear in the dark is not the wind. It is the language the past has chosen to speak with you. From which city and at what time are you watching us? Don't forget to subscribe and leave a like so you don't get lost in the darkness. Now, the story begins. Get ready. The Endless Highway, the Anatolian Transit. My name is Robert Miller, an expatriate and logistics consultant who has spent the last year traversing the vast, rugged landscapes of Turkey. I have driven from the bustling ports of Istanbul to the sun-drenched plains of the southeast, finding beauty in every winding road. Yet, there is a stretch of highway between Denizli and Antalya that defies the logic of the living. It is a route where the horizon seems to fold, where the sky transitions into a color that is not quite natural, and where the jinn, primordial beings that have claimed these mountain passes as their own, wait for the unwary traveler. They do not hunt with claws or teeth. They simply excise the soul from the vessel, leaving behind a husk that bleeds with a profound, terrifying stillness. I was driving a standard intercity route, the darkness pressing against the windshield like a physical weight, when I encountered the first signs of the harvest. I had stopped at a remote bus terminal, a place of dust and flickering fluorescent lights, where the air tasted of cold stone. I saw a line of passengers waiting for a bus that would never arrive. They were standing in perfect, unnerving synchronicity. As I watched from the shadows of my vehicle, a collective tremor rippled through the group. Without a sound, without a stumble, they simply ceased. Their bodies slumped onto the cracked concrete, and a thick dark crimson fluid began to weep from their pores, pooling into a silent, expanding lake of blood that seemed to hum with an ancient resonant frequency. The jinn are not monsters that chase. They are the vacuum that pulls life out of the world. They exist in the spaces where the road bends and the mountains close in, claiming those who are mid-transit as their sustenance. I realized then that my own journey had been steered by something unseen, a path laid out to bring me to this precise moment of observation. The terminal was no longer a transit hub. It was a distillation point, a place where human vitality is separated from its biological shell and pulled into a dimension that exists just beyond the reach of our sight. I watched as the blood seeped into the very foundations of the building, a silent offering to the entities that inhabit the mountain air. I am now parked on the shoulder of the pass, miles from any town or human habitation. The road ahead is empty, the asphalt shimmering with a light that does not come from the moon. I know the jinn are moving through the pass, their presence felt as a sudden plummeting of temperature and a sharpening of the metallic tang in the air. They do not need to break the glass or touch the metal of my truck. They only need to exist within the same space. My own breathing has become labored, my limbs growing heavy, as if the gravity of the valley is intensifying. I'm watching the road become a river of deep, dark fluid, a path for the spirits that have been unmoored from their bodies. There is no turning back, for the road behind me has dissolved into the same void that waits ahead. I see the bus terminal again, though I am miles away, a phantom image superimposed over the reality of the highway. I see the passengers again, their faces turned toward me in a silent, collective plea that I can no longer interpret. They are part of the harvest now, their essence integrated into the landscape itself, a landscape that is beginning to claim me as its own. My pulse is a distant, flickering rhythm, losing its sync with the reality I once knew. I am the final traveler in a journey that has no destination, merely a transition into the hungry ancient shadow of the Anatolian heights. The road is quiet, save for the rhythmic dripping of the blood that is beginning to coat the interior of the cab. I do not fear the cessation of my heartbeat, for I have seen the grace of the transition. The jinn are not malicious in their hunger. They are merely the keepers of the border, the harvesters of the fields we call life. My vision is fracturing into 1,000 shards of light, each one a different fading moment of a life lived in the sun. The mountains are pulling me into their cold stone embrace, dissolving the memory of my name into the wind that howls through the pass. I'm the silence that follows the scream, the stillness that settles over the highway after the last traveler has been claimed. The horizon is gone, the road is infinite, and I'm finally, irrevocably, one with the endless blood-soaked night. The Crimson Quarantine Incident at Sector 4. My name is Dr. Henry Blackwood, a lead epidemiologist tasked with overseeing the containment of a mysterious viral outbreak in a remote, fenced-off research facility in the high deserts of New Mexico. The facility, known as Sector 4, was built over an ancient, subterranean network that local legends claimed was a gateway for jinn, primordial entities that exist outside our reality. We believed the rapid deaths of our staff were caused by a pathogen, a microscopic terror. However, as the quarantine tightened and the perimeter became absolute, I realized the truth. The jinn were not infecting us. They were reclaiming the occupants of this site as a harvest. They do not kill with biological agents. They simply excise the vitality from the living, leaving behind hollow husks that weep blood in a silent, crimson deluge. The facility is a maze of sterile white corridors, pressurized airlocks, and cold fluorescent lighting that hums with an unnerving frequency. The quarantine protocols were meant to keep a virus in, but instead, they served as a cage for the jinn to finish their collection. I sat in the command center, watching the monitors as my colleagues in the observation lab collapsed. There was no struggle, no physical entry of an intruder, and no alarm of violence. They were standing, examining slides, and then they simply ceased. Their bodies crumpled with a synchronized weight, and from their eyes, nostrils, and parted lips, a thick, dark, and viscous fluid began to pool, soak in the floor in a rhythmic, deliberate pattern of blood. The jinn are not manifesting in form. They are an atmospheric presence, a pressure against the very physics of the room. They harvested the research team one sector at a time, moving through the airlocks with an efficiency that defies our understanding of reality. I stood behind the reinforced glass of the command center, paralyzed by the sight of my staff being systematically reaped. There was no scream, only the sound of blood hitting the linoleum. A steady, hypnotic dripping that echoed through the entire facility. The jinn are not merely ending lives, they are extracting the essence from the shells, pulling the souls into a dimension that exists just behind the veil of our own. I have spent the last 6 hours documenting this sequence of events in my digital log, but I know no one will ever read these entries. The quarantine is absolute, and the jinn are moving toward the command center now. I can hear the soft rhythmic pulsing of the earth, a sound like a heartbeat that is not my own. There is no point in seeking further isolation. The walls of this facility are no barrier to things that do not inhabit our physical plane. They want the life within these walls, and they are coming to collect it. My pulse is erratic, thrumming in my ears like a funeral drum. I have watched the strongest among us succumb to the silence. And now, the heavy door to the command center is beginning to bleed from the seams. The atmosphere in the room has shifted. It is freezing, an absolute zero that bites at my skin. I see the blood beginning to bead on the surface of the command console, a slow, dark seepage that defies the laws of gravity. The jinn are here, and the space between me and the encroaching void is rapidly vanishing. I do not fear the pain of dying. I fear the total cessation of my consciousness, the feeling of being pulled apart and spread across the ether like autumn leaves in a storm. My vision is narrowing, the edges of the room blurring into the same deep, oppressive violet that I saw in the observation lab when the first researchers fell. I am no longer a doctor. I am merely a collection of biological components that is about to be disassembled. The final remnants of light are fading from the control room, replaced by a suffocating, unnatural gloom. I feel my thoughts becoming disjointed, my memories fracturing as they are drawn out from the back of my mind. The jinn are not in the room. The room has become the jinn. Every fiber of the synthetic flooring, every breath of recirculated air is being repurposed for their design. My heart gives one final, jarring thump. And then, there is only the sensation of falling upward into a cold, endless expanse. The keys of the console slip from my numbing fingers, marking the last record of a life that has been measured, taken, and filed away in the darkness. There is no tomorrow for Sector 4, no rescue to sweep away the red stains on the floor. The harvest has been gathered, and the desert facility is returned to the ancient, hungry silence that preceded our arrival. Everything that was once human has been rendered into the earth, leaving the steel and concrete to stand as the only witnesses to our departure. The Midnight Voyage on the Puget Sound. My name is George Hatcher, a maritime historian who has spent my life documenting the forgotten legends of the Pacific Northwest. I found myself in Seattle, Washington, boarding a private night ferry across the dark, churning waters of the Puget Sound for a family reunion hosted by my estranged cousins. The ferry, an aging vessel with peeling paint and a rusted hull, glided through the heavy, fog-drenched night, far from the lights of the city. We were a family seeking reconciliation, but we had unknowingly drifted into the domain of the jinn, primordial entities that claimed these cold, deep waters as their feeding ground. They do not fight with steel or fire. They simply harvest the life force from the living, leaving behind empty vessels that bleed until the sea claims them. The boat was silent. The only sound, the rhythmic slapping of the black water against the metal hull. My cousin, a man named Thomas, was standing on the aft deck, his eyes fixed on the impenetrable mist. As I approached, the air plummeted in temperature, turning our breath into thick, white clouds. There was no sound of a struggle, no physical force. Yet Thomas simply stopped. A brief, unnatural stillness overcame him, and then he collapsed onto the deck. Without a single motion from an assailant, his body became a heavy, lifeless husk. From his eyes and nostrils, a thick, dark crimson fluid began to weep, soaking into the wood of the deck in a silent, flowing tide that smelled of rusted iron and brine. The jinn were present not as monsters, but as a total deprivation of life. I rushed to the salon to find the rest of my family, but the scene was the same. My aunt and uncle, sitting at the mahogany table, had been reaped. They were slumped over their half-finished drinks, their expressions frozen in a permanent, hollow shock. The jinn were harvesting the family, pulling the spirits of the living into a dimension that exists just behind the veil of our sight. I watched as the blood seeped into the floorboards, a dark map of the life that had been extracted. The ferry was no longer a vessel for transportation. It was a distillation point, a place where human vitality was being converted into sustenance for ancient, hungry shadows. I retreated to the bridge, locking the heavy brass door behind me. But the presence of the jinn was already inside. I could feel them moving through the cabin, their hunger a palpable weight that made my lungs burn with the need for air. They were not interested in my fear or my history. They were simply completing the collection. Every flick of the ferry's navigation lights signaled another life being gathered, another pool of blood forming in the dark. I am the final witness, the last entry in a ledger written in the silent language of the dead. There is no escape, no hidden path to take, and no hope of rescue from the depths of the sound. The water seems to be rising, not toward the deck, but toward my very soul, pulling me down into the cold, deep abyss of the harvest. The fog has become a wall of solid, impenetrable blackness, and the ferry is no longer moving toward the harbor. I feel the blood rising around my boots, a tide of iron and sorrow that grows higher with every passing heartbeat. My faith in the laws of the sea has been replaced by the cold realization that we are living on borrowed time in a world that is not entirely ours to keep. The jinn are moving through the ferry, their presence felt as a cooling of the air and an insurmountable pressure on the soul. Every step I take toward the railing feels like walking through deep, freezing water. There will be no mourning for us, no return to the docks of Seattle, and no record of the tragedy that transpired on these dark waters. The harvest is complete, the sound is quiet, and I surrender to the inevitable end that has claimed everyone I arrived with. My consciousness is shattering, drifting like dry leaves into the immense waiting void, leaving the boat to drift forever in the eternal, hungry dark. The stars are gone, the waves are silent, and the abyss finally claims its due. The flickering void, the grand theater of Oakhaven. My name is Silas Whitlock, an archivist of cinematic history who has traveled the desolate, forgotten towns of rural Nebraska to document the decay of mid-century theaters. I arrived in Oakhaven, a town so isolated that it barely registers on modern maps, to inspect the Grand Theater, a relic of velvet, gold leaf, and structural neglect. The locals avoided the building as if it were a tomb, speaking in hushed tones about the patrons who never left during the final screening decades ago. I believed these to be the standard yarns of small-town superstition, but as I stood in the auditorium, the air became heavy with an unnatural, stifling density. The jinn had claimed this theater not as a structure, but as a harvest ground where they extract the vitality of the living, leaving only empty husks behind. The auditorium was unnervingly vast. the rows of seats stretching into the gloom like ribs of a colossal, decaying beast. As I worked on the projector, the atmosphere grew frigid, a cold that tasted of iron and ancient dust. Suddenly, the theater was filled with shadows, not projections, but entities that existed in the periphery of my vision. There were no sounds of struggle, no physical attacks. There was only a sharp, rhythmic tapping from the rows below. I looked down and saw a group of urban explorers who had broken in through the rear exit. They stood frozen, their bodies rigid, their expressions vacant. Within seconds, they collapsed into the seats, and from their ears, noses, and eyes, a thick dark blood began to weep, saturating the velvet upholstery in a silent crimson flood. The jinn were present, invisible and omnipresent, siphoning the essence of those who occupied the space. They were not killing in the mortal sense. They were reclaiming, drawing the life force of the victims into a dimension that existed behind the flickering film. Every time the screen groaned with static, another life force was harvested. Another body surrendered its vitality, and more blood filled the aisles. I watched from the safety of the booth, unable to move, unable to speak, as the theater floor turned into a shallow, dark lake of iron-scented fluid. The jinn were methodical, tending to their harvest with a detached, cold efficiency that defied my understanding of the natural world. I am now trapped in the booth, the steel door humming with a vibration that is not electrical. I can feel the presence of the entities pressing against the glass, their hunger, a palpable force that makes my heart beat irregular and my thoughts sluggish. They are not interested in my fear. They are interested in the duration of my existence. I have watched the theater fill with the fallen, and I know that when the final reel ends, the room will be silent, and I will be the last one to be claimed. There is no hope for intervention, no possibility of rescue, and no logic that can explain the red tide rising toward the stairs of the booth. My journal is my only witness, though I know no one will ever read these entries. The light from the projector has shifted from black and white to a deep, pulsating violet, a frequency that seems to dissolve the very matter of the room. I feel my own breath becoming shallow, a strange hollow sensation blossoming in my chest as the jinn draw the warmth from my veins. The theater is no longer a place of entertainment. It is an extension of the jinn's own domain, a localized collapse of reality where human vitality is converted into their sustenance. My hands are shaking so violently that the words are beginning to bleed together on the page, mirroring the carnage in the rows below. The screen ahead has grown transparent, revealing a vast, endless landscape of ash and shadow that lies on the other side of our world. The jinn are pulling me toward it, not with hands, but with an irresistible, magnetic hunger. The blood from the rows below has reached the base of the booth, a rising tide that carries the echoes of every lost soul that ever entered Oakhaven. I can no longer feel the weight of my own body, for it is being hollowed out, the essence of Silas Whitlock being distilled into the very air I am breathing. There will be no mourning for Oakhaven, and no record of the events that transpired in the Grand Theatre will survive the coming dawn. The curtains are falling, not on a show, but on the extinction of all who dared to step into the darkness of the rows. My consciousness is shattering, drifting like dry leaves into the immense waiting void of the projector's light. The last of my life flows out, feeding the eternal thirst of the unseen watchers. And the theater settles into a peace that is as profound as it is terrifyingly final.
The secret ingredient of Blackwood Manor. My name is Julian, and I was once considered the finest sous chef in all of Lyon, France. In the culinary world, we often speak of soul being the key to a perfect dish. But after what I witnessed in the summer of 2024, I realized that some souls are never meant to be consumed. I am writing this from a hidden cellar, my hands still trembling as I smell the faint, iron-like scent of blood on my apron, a scent that no amount of soap can wash away. It began with an invitation to the Blackwood Manor, a secluded estate perched on the jagged cliffs of the Amalfi Coast in Italy. The owner, a reclusive aristocrat named Count Marcello, was looking for a personal chef to prepare a centennial feast. The pay was more than I would make in a decade, but the conditions were strange. I was to bring no ingredients of my own, and I was never to enter the pantry after midnight. When I arrived, the beauty of the Mediterranean was overshadowed by the oppressive gloom of the manor. The kitchen was a masterpiece of copper and stone, but the air felt heavy, as if the walls themselves were breathing. Marcello was a gaunt man with skin like yellowed parchment and eyes that seemed to reflect a fire that wasn't there. "Tonight, Julian," he whispered, his voice like dry leaves, "you will cook the pasta manamarum. The recipe is ancient. It requires precision, devotion, and a specific kind of seasoning." He handed me a leather-bound book. The pages weren't paper. They were thin sheets of dried skin. The ink was a dark, pulsating crimson. As I read the recipe, my blood ran cold. It wasn't cooking, it was a ritual. It called for herbs that only grew in graveyards and a broth simmered for 72 hours with the bones of the unbaptized. I thought it was a joke, a dark, eccentric, theatrical display of the rich. I was wrong. On the third night, I broke the rule. I entered the pantry at 1 a.m. The room was larger than the kitchen itself, filled with jars of preserving fluids. But they weren't holding vegetables. Inside the glass were human eyes, tongues, and hearts, all twitching as if still alive. In the center of the room, Marcello stood over a boiling cauldron, chanting in a tongue that sounded like bones grinding together. He was pouring a shimmering black bile into the pot, a liquid shadow that defied gravity. "The magic is in the consumption, Julian," he said without turning around. "To eat is to dominate, to digest is to become." He turned to me, and his face was shifting, his jaw elongated, and I saw rows of needle-like teeth. He wasn't just a man. He was a vessel for a hunger that had lasted centuries. He explained that the great sickness that took his family generations ago wasn't a plague, but a botched immortality spell. Now they had to eat life to prevent their own bodies from turning into dust. The feast began at 3 a.m. The guests arrived in black carriages, skeletal figures dressed in fine silks, their skin translucent and their movements jerky like puppets. I was forced to serve the dish. As they ate, the color returned to their cheeks, but the light in the room died. The candles burned black. Then came the final course, the sacrifice. Marcello looked at me with a hunger that bypassed the stomach and went straight for the spirit. "A chef always pours himself into his work," he grinned. "They didn't want my cooking anymore. They wanted the chef as the dessert." The doors slammed shut. The silver cutlery on the table began to float, turning into jagged daggers. I survived only by throwing a container of highly flammable truffle oil into the enchanted hearth, creating a blast of blue fire that disrupted their ritual. In the chaos, as the guests shrieked in a frequency that shattered every glass in the manor, I ran. I jumped from the kitchen window into the freezing tyrannical sea below. I am safe for now, but I can't eat. Every time I see meat, I see Stefan's eyes. Every time I smell soup, I hear the chanting of the dead. Marcello is still out there, and he's still hungry. He's looking for a new chef, a new soul to spice his eternal life. If you are a cook and you receive an invitation to a cliffside manor in Italy, starve. It is better to die of hunger than to become the meal.
Shadows beneath the neon. My name is Marcus Reed, and I serve as a security supervisor for the exclusive VIP lounges surrounding Times Square in New York City, where my duty is to maintain order while the masses celebrate the turning of the year. I'm a man accustomed to the frantic energy of the city, the blinding strobe lights, and the suffocating crowds. But on this night, while I monitored the cordoned-off section of a prestigious viewing lounge, I witnessed a phenomenon that permanently shattered my perception of this world. The jinn, ancient, incorporeal entities, have claimed this site to harvest lives through an inexplicable and silent mechanism. They seek no physical confrontation. They demand only the suffering of others as a ritual offering, leaving the intruders who found their way into the restricted area in a silent, blood-soaked stillness against the plush carpet, before dragging their chosen prey into the invisible darkness beyond the shimmering digital billboards. The lounge felt burdened by an atmosphere unlike any other space in Manhattan. The air tasted of sterile champagne, expensive perfume, and that distinct scent of impending decay, which can never be masked by luxury. The atmosphere shifted abruptly. It was as if someone had drained the very oxygen from the room, replacing it with an absolute abyssal void. I heard no sounds from the roaring crowds below, no festive music, only the pressing presence of something that breathed without lungs. Two individuals who had bypassed the security perimeter sat in the velvet chairs, completely motionless. Without a scream, without a spasm, they were subjected to a torture that left no external marks on their clothing, but which transformed their internal essence into a landscape of unbearable agony. The sight that met me as I carefully stepped into the dim light of the lounge was of such macabre precision that my legs betrayed me. From their eyes, noses, and mouths, a thick, dark red stream of blood began to seep, a direct consequence of the torment the jinn exerted without touching them. The blood pooled across the polished floor, saturating the high-end furnishings and creating patterns that resembled a map of lost souls. The jinn were present as an invisible, heavy atmosphere that converted the VIP lounge into a different dimension of reality. They did not feed on the flesh, but on the essence of suffering that departed the bodies in the moment of expiration. Before I could react, I saw the emptied bodies lifted by invisible forces and carried away toward the darkest corners of the complex, as if they had never existed at all. The jinn drifted between the tortured remnants, felt as a low-frequency vibration that vibrated painfully through the architecture. They do not merely kill, they allow death to become a portion of their harvest and carry souls into an unknown dimension. Every drop of blood on the floor was proof of the completion of a cycle that had begun long before the construction of this city. I am the final witness to a transaction that has etched itself deeply into the history of Times Square. The lounge now feels like a sacrificial chamber, a facade hiding the hungry dimension behind it. I know I am next. My own vitality soon to be added to their vast, insatiable record. Every detail of my surroundings begins to warp, as if the lights of the world are finally being extinguished for good. My hands tremble as I record these words in my private log, where the ink already bleeds into the crimson fluid pooling from the drained corpses. The whispering in my head becomes louder, a sound from eons ago, which no longer requires human language to understand. New York is no longer a city of progress, but a maw that slowly closes over my soul. I feel the warmth leaving my body as the jinn conclude their ceremony by extinguishing the final spark of life. My heartbeat becomes a slow, laborious process that aligns itself with the cold silence of the room. Everything I once defined as reality has perished in the darkness beside the shimmering screens. The blackness surrounding me expands, an endless sea of nothingness that consumes every memory. The velvet chairs seem to bleed shadows, and the victims are now gone, their bodies transported to a realm from which no human can return. There is no path back to the light, no escape from the relentless ceremony that now finds its conclusion. Everything I once was is merely an echo in the eternal silence of the abyss. The building has forgotten us, and the floor demands its tribute without emitting a single sound. I dissolve into the shadows, a final offering to the jinn who wait in the dark for the next trespasser. My pulse fades in rhythm with the dripping blood, and the void has now finally swallowed my essence in the midst of the cold, festive night. The vintage vintner's toll. Shadows in the Napa Valley. My name is Julian Thorne, and for 20 years I have been a master vintner in the sprawling, sun-drenched estates of the Napa Valley in California. I pride myself on the quality of the vintage, on the history of the vines, and the sanctity of the cellar. However, something has infested the roots of this valley. A presence not of this earth, but of the jinn. They have claimed the dark, cavernous depths of our historic wine cellars as a place of harvest. They do not drink the wine. They drink the essence of those who seek oblivion in the bottle. To the outside world, these deaths are dismissed as tragic cases of alcohol poisoning. But I know the truth. The jinn are harvesting the vitality of those who cross the threshold of our darkest vaults, pulling their spirits into a void that leaves behind only a blood-soaked shell. The incident occurred last Saturday, during a private tasting in our deepest underground cellar. My guests, a group of collectors, had sought the rarest vintage in our private reserve. The air in the cellar was cold, heavy with the scent of fermenting grapes and a deeper, metallic tang that I recognized as iron. As they raised their glasses, a heavy, unnatural stillness descended upon the room. There was no sound of struggle, no physical force, and no violence from any assailant. They simply stopped. One moment, they were laughing. The next, they were slumped into their chairs, their bodies becoming heavy, lifeless husks. From their eyes, noses, and mouths, a thick, dark crimson fluid began to weep, saturating the stone floor in a silent, flowing tide. The jinn were present in the cellar, though they remained unseen. Their presence was a pressure against my mind. A cold, starving void that was systematically reaping the life of the guests. They were not killing in the traditional sense. They were reclaiming. They were pulling the vitality of the collectors into a dimension that existed just behind the visual spectrum, leaving only their biological remains to bleed out onto the cold floor. I stood in the corner, unable to move, watching as the cellar became a dark, arterial map of the life that had been extracted. It was a harvest of the most exquisite sort, where the indulgence of the flesh was the bait and the spirit was the prize. I retreated to the tasting room, locking the heavy oak door, but I knew it was no barrier to beings that existed outside our physical laws. I could feel them moving through the cellar, their hunger a palpable weight that made my lungs burn with the need for air. They were moving through the rows of barrels like farmers tending to a crop. Every time the cellar groaned, another life was snuffed out. Another pool of blood formed in the shadows below. I am the final witness, the last entry in a ledger written in the silent language of the dead. There is no possibility of rescue, for the valley outside has dissolved into the same void that claimed the collectors. I am now sitting in the shadows of the distillery, the air saturated with the scent of grapeskin and sorrow. I can feel my own vitality being drawn out. A slow, draining sensation as if the very foundations of the estate are drinking my life through the soles of my shoes. There is no hope of being found, for the entrance to the cellar is now an impassable wall of nothingness. I have become a part of the winery's inventory, a final entry in a ledger written in blood. My flashlight flickers, its beam struggling against the encroaching gloom, as the shadows detach themselves from the barrels and begin to close the distance. The walls are thinning, the boundary between the cellar and the dimension of the gin becoming as fragile as paper. I am watching my own hands as the color fades from them, the skin becoming translucent and cold. The winery is no longer a structure of stone and glass. It is a mouth, and I'm already deep within its throat. My thoughts are fragmenting, my memories dissolving into the static that vibrates in the stagnant air. There is no pain, only the profound, sinking realization that I was never meant to leave these depths. The harvest is complete. The tally of the dead has reached its zenith, and the estate returns to its eternal, sterile slumber. My vision slips into the gray, the darkness of the vaults becoming a sea that swallows the last of my consciousness. Everything that was once me is now merely a memory, a drop of crimson in an endless echoing void that no longer remembers the names of the lost. The hollow echo of Blackwood Hollow. My name is Samuel Hedges, an itinerant surveyor hired to map the forgotten territories of rural Kentucky. I arrived in Blackwood Hollow, a place so isolated that the maps themselves seemed to reject its existence. The village, nestled in a dense, suffocating valley, appeared abandoned at first, but the silence was deceptive. The residents had not left. They had been harvested. The jinn, primordial entities that exist in the interstices of our world, had claimed this valley as their feeding ground. They do not kill with steel or malice. They simply exist, and in their presence, the life force of the living is revoked, leaving behind empty husks that weep blood in a silent crimson deluge. The village consisted of dilapidated wooden cottages that leaned toward each other as if sharing a secret of impending doom. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth and something metallic, like stagnant iron. As I entered the town square, I encountered the villagers. They stood in the center of the path, rows of them, perfectly motionless. There was no sound of conversation, no greeting, no movement. A sudden unnatural stillness descended upon them. They did not fall from a blow. They simply crumpled, their bodies becoming heavy, lifeless shells. Within seconds, a thick, dark, viscous fluid began to weep from their eyes, ears, and mouths, staining the dirt in patterns that seemed almost intentional. The jinn were there, invisible and untouchable, pulling the spirits of the fallen into a dimension that exists just behind the veil of our own. I retreated to my vehicle, parked at the edge of the woods, but I knew it was no barrier to things that do not inhabit our physical plane. I watched from the driver's seat, paralyzed, as the jinn systematically reaped the remaining inhabitants. There was no screaming, no chaotic flight, only a series of silent, sudden collapses. Each time the jinn moved, a life ended. They were not killing in the traditional sense. They were reclaiming. They dragged the remnants of the lives they had snatched into the darkness of the trees, disappearing into the dense foliage with their stolen cargo. The village, which had been filled with the energy of human souls, was emptying out as the night progressed. The scent of copper was so intense that it felt as if I were breathing liquid iron. I knew then that none of us were meant to leave this hollow. I have spent the last 3 hours documenting this sequence of events in my surveyor's log, my fingers trembling as I press the pen into the paper. Outside, the jinn are moving toward the perimeter of my camp. I can hear the soft, rhythmic pulsing of the earth, a sound like a heartbeat that is not my own. There's no point in seeking shelter. The walls of my vehicle are no barrier to things that do not inhabit our physical plane. They want the life within this valley, and they are coming to collect the last of it. My pulse is erratic, thrumming in my ears like a funeral drum. I have watched the strongest among us succumb to the silence, and now the door handle of my truck is beginning to turn, though there is no one on the other side. The atmosphere in the cab has changed. It is cold, an absolute zero that bites at my skin. I see the blood beginning to bead on the surface of my dashboard, a slow, dark seepage that defies the laws of gravity. The jinn are here, and the space between me and the encroaching void is rapidly vanishing. I do not fear the pain of dying. I fear the total cessation of my consciousness, the feeling of being pulled apart and spread across the ether like autumn leaves in a storm. My vision is narrowing, the edges of the dashboard blurring into the same deep, oppressive violet that I saw in the village square. I'm no longer a surveyor. I'm merely a collection of biological components that is about to be disassembled. The final remnants of light are fading from the cab, replaced by a suffocating, unnatural gloom. I feel my thoughts becoming disjointed, my memories fracturing as they are drawn out from the back of my mind. The jinn are not in the truck. The truck has become the jinn. Every fiber of the seat, every breath of air is being repurposed for their design. My heart gives one final jarring thump, and then there's only the sensation of falling upward into a cold, endless expanse. The pen slips from my numbing fingers, marking the last record of a life that has been measured, taken, and filed away in the darkness. There's no tomorrow for Blackwood Hollow, no sunrise to sweep away the red stains on the earth. The harvest has been gathered. and the valley is returned to the ancient hungry silence that preceded our arrival. Everything that was once human has been rendered into the soil, leaving the pines to stand as the only witnesses to our departure. The Crimson Covenant of the Hollow, a wedding in the Appalachians. My name is Marcus Sterling, a photographer specializing in abandoned rural architecture, and I found myself in a remote, unnamed valley deep within the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia. I had been commissioned to document an old decaying farmhouse for a historical society, but upon arriving, I discovered a gathering that defied human comprehension. It was a wedding, not of locals, but of entities that radiated a cold, ancient hunger. The jinn had convened in the dilapidated barn to celebrate a covenant, and they had brought hundreds of unsuspecting villagers from the surrounding woods to act as both audience and harvest. They do not kill with weapons. They exist as a crushing, invisible pressure that extracts the life force from the living, leaving behind hollow vessels that weep thick dark blood as they are pulled into the shadows. The barn was draped in withered black vines that seemed to pulse with a low rhythmic vibration. The guests were seated in perfect rows, their faces pale and their eyes wide with a permanent hollow shock. As I watched from the shadows of the hayloft, the ceremony began. There was no music, only a deep, resonant thrumming that vibrated through the very marrow of my bones. Without a sound, the villagers began to collapse in a synchronized cascade. It was not a physical fall caused by a blow, but the sudden cessation of their biological existence. From every pore of their skin, a dark, viscous fluid began to seep, coating the dirt floor in a silent crimson sea that reflected the moonlight filtering through the gaps in the wood. The jinn were not manifesting in form. They were the atmosphere itself, a chilling presence that drew the heat from the room and the breath from the lungs of everyone present. They were harvesting the essence of the wedding guests, pulling the sparks of their consciousness into a dimension that existed just beyond the visual spectrum. I saw the bride and groom at the center of the altar, or what passed for one, a shimmering distortion in the air that felt like a localized collapse of reality. They were not human, nor were they beast. They were architects of the void, orchestrating the transition of human vitality from the physical plane into their own hungry, eternal domain. I remained frozen in the hayloft, my camera heavy and useless in my hands. The sight of the flowing blood, which formed intricate arterial patterns across the barn floor, was the most terrifying thing I have ever documented. I realized that the wedding was not a celebration of union, but a massive extraction event designed to feed the jinn for generations. Every time the air vibrated with that low thrum, another life was extinguished. Another pool of crimson was added to the landscape of the barn. I was witnessing the final moments of an entire community, harvested like wheat in a field by entities that have been watching us from the cracks in the world since the dawn of time. I am now sitting in the darkness of the woods outside, miles from my vehicle, with no path back to the reality I once understood. The barn is silent again, but the air still tastes of iron and ancient earth. The jinn are moving through the trees, their presence felt as a cooling of the wind and an insurmountable pressure on my soul. I have become a part of the ledger, a witness to a transaction that can never be undone. My hands are colorless. the warmth of my life already surrendering to the encroaching chill of the forest. The woods are closing in, and I know that I'm the final offering in this crimson covenant. Everything I was, everything I believed, is being folded into the abyss of the valley, leaving the Appalachians to stand as the only witnesses to our departure. The harvest is complete, the valley is quiet, and the hunger that resides in the deep earth finally finds its fulfillment in my own fading heartbeat. The last of my life flows out, feeding the eternal thirst of the unseen, and the mountains settle into a peace that is as profound as it is terrifyingly final. The neon labyrinth of lost souls. My name is Garrett Miller, and I work as the late-night floor attendant for a sprawling historic casino in Las Vegas, Nevada. My life revolves around the hum of thousands of slot machines, the rhythmic blinking of LED displays, and the endless maze of rows that stretch into the dark corners of the gaming floor. I am a man who has learned to ignore the artificial cheer of the casino, but tonight, while patrolling the deepest part of the slot machine labyrinth, I witnessed a phenomenon that permanently destroyed my peace. The jinn, ancient incorporeal entities, have claimed this gambling floor as their arena to harvest lives through an inexplicable and silent mechanism. They seek no physical conflict. They demand only the suffering of others as a ritual offering, and leave the intruders who wandered into the restricted slot machine rows in a silent, blood-soaked stillness against the carpeted floor, before dragging their chosen prey into the invisible darkness beyond the blinking lights. The labyrinth of machines was filled with an atmosphere that did not belong in a place of entertainment. The air tasted of stale smoke, floor wax, and that distinct scent of impending decay, which can never be masked by the casino's ventilation. The atmosphere shifted abruptly. It was as if someone had drained the entire floor of its artificial excitement and replaced it with an absolute, abyssal void. I heard no sounds from the nearby card tables, no clinking of chips, only the pressing presence of something that breathed without lungs. Two individuals who had strayed from the public area sat at one of the mechanical slot banks, completely motionless. Without a cry, without a spasm, they were subjected to a torment that left no external marks on their clothing, but which turned their internal essence into a landscape of unbearable agony. The sight that met me as I carefully stepped among the machines was of such macabre precision that my legs betrayed me. From their eyes, noses, and mouths, a thick, dark red stream of blood began to seep, a direct consequence of the torment the jinn exerted without making any contact. The blood pooled across the patterned carpet, saturating the base of the machines and creating patterns that resembled a map of lost souls. The jinn were present as an invisible, heavy atmosphere that converted the slot labyrinth into a different dimension of reality. They did not feed on the flesh, but on the essence of suffering that departed the bodies in the moment of expiration. Before I could react, I saw the emptied bodies lifted by unseen forces and carried away toward the darkest maintenance corridors, as if they had never existed in this casino at all. The jinn drifted between the tortured remnants, felt as a low-frequency vibration that resonated painfully through the reinforced steel machines. They do not merely kill, they allow death to become a portion of their harvest and carry souls into an unknown dimension. Every drop of blood on the floor was proof of the completion of a cycle that had begun long before this casino was ever built. I am the final witness to a transaction that has etched itself deeply into the history of Las Vegas. The slot labyrinth now feels like a sacrificial altar, a facade hiding the hungry dimension behind it. I know I am next, my own vitality soon to be added to their vast, insatiable register. Every detail of my surroundings begins to warp, as if the lights of the city are finally being extinguished for good. My hands tremble as I record these words in my handheld ledger, where the ink already bleeds into the crimson fluid pooling from the drained corpses. The whispering in my head becomes louder, a sound from eons ago, which no longer requires human language to understand. Las Vegas is no longer a city of luck, but a maw that slowly closes over my soul. I feel the warmth leaving my body as the jinn conclude their ceremony by extinguishing the final spark of life. My heartbeat becomes a slow, laborious process that aligns itself with the cold silence of the machines. Everything I once defined as reality has perished in the darkness beside the flickering reels. The blackness surrounding me expands, an endless sea of nothingness that consumes every memory. The glowing screens seem to bleed shadows, and the victims are now gone, their bodies transported to a realm from which no human can return. There is no path back to the light, no escape from the relentless ceremony that now finds its conclusion. Everything I once was is merely an echo in the eternal silence of the abyss. The casino has forgotten us, and the floor demands its tribute without emitting a single sound. I dissolve into the shadows, a final offering to the jinn who wait in the dark for the next trespasser. My pulse fades in rhythm with the dripping blood, and the void has now finally swallowed my essence in the midst of the cold, mechanical stillness.